South Africa. Terrible things are happening in South Africa.
And we will not be bullied.
The leadership is doing some terrible things, horrible things. So
we will stand together as a united nation, and we will speak with one voice in defense of our national interests.
They're taking away land, they're confiscating land, and actually they're doing things that are perhaps far worse than that.
Hey everyone, welcome back. Today, we're exploring an issue that's been making serious waves globally: South Africa's new land reform law. Specifically, the Expropriation Act passed in 2024. Now, if you haven't been keeping up with this, don't worry. By the end of this video, you'll have a full understanding of why this issue has sparked so much controversy, especially between South Africa and the US. So what's all the fuss about? Well, South Africa is trying to tackle a massive inequality in land ownership, a direct legacy of apartheid. But there's one clause in this new law that's got the world talking: the ability to expropriate land without compensation under very specific circumstances. Let's break it down. It's really important to understand that even though apartheid officially ended decades ago, the effects of those really discriminatory land policies are still being felt today. We are talking about a system where for generations, black majority was systematically prevented from owning land, while a small white minority controlled the vast, vast majority of it. So this law is an attempt to try to right that historical wrong. But as you can imagine, it's an incredibly complex and sensitive issue. It's not just a case of grabbing land from anyone who happens to be white. No, not at all. The no compensation clause is very specific. It really only comes into play in situations where the land is shown to be unused, or it's being held purely for speculation, or it's been abandoned completely. The idea is to target land that's not being used productively and could be better used to address this historical imbalance. Figures like President Donald Trump and Elon Musk have been pretty vocal in their condemnation of this law. Their statements have definitely kind of thrown gasoline on the fire. Trump, in his characteristically blunt way, accused South Africa of confiscating land and treating people very badly. He even went so far as to threaten to cut US funding. And Musk, he was actually born in South Africa. He's gone even further, using the word genocide in his posts online. And he's claiming that white farmers are being killed on a daily basis. Some pretty loaded terms to be using. Do those claims hold any water? Well, that's where things get a little tricky. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa has directly denied these claims. He's emphasized that the Expropriation Act is meant to be a legal process aimed at equitable land distribution. He actually even had a phone call directly with Musk to try and clear up some of the misinformation that was circulating online. A lot of back and forth is going on with some pretty extreme viewpoints being thrown around. But what about the people who actually live in South Africa? Are their views as polarized as the international headlines would have us believe? While there's definitely support for land reform, especially among black South Africans, there are actually a variety of opinions on how that should be achieved. Even among those who support the idea of land reform, it's not a homogeneous viewpoint. For example, you have the Democratic Alliance, which is one of the main opposition parties. They've raised concerns about the potential for negative economic impacts if this law isn't implemented in a way that respects property rights. Their stance is more about making sure it's done responsibly than being totally opposed to the whole idea. Then you have groups like the Freedom Front Plus, a right-wing party with largely white membership. They are strongly opposed to this law, calling it unconstitutional, and are planning to challenge it in court. So, there are people who are really worried about the potential consequences of this law even within South Africa itself. To understand those concerns, we need to take a closer look at the historical context that led us to this point. Apartheid was a system whereby law you were prevented from owning land simply because of your race. Back in 1913, a law passed that restricted black African land ownership to just 7% of the country. That was later increased to just 13% in 1936. But that's still, a tiny amount. Basically, that handed over huge areas of land to the white minority, while, of course, the black majority was squeezed into these really overcrowded townships. Those laws were eventually repealed in 1991, but the damage was already done. So even though apartheid officially ended in 94, those deeply unequal land ownership patterns continued. White farmers continued to own a really disproportionate amount of land. A land audit in 2017 showed that white people who make up only 8% of the population own something like 3/4 of all farms and agricultural holdings, which is a huge discrepancy. This explains why for many black South Africans, this new law represents a long-awaited step towards justice. A chance to reclaim what was taken from their ancestors, essentially. They see it as a way to gain economic empowerment, land ownership, and ultimately create a more equitable society. For them, this is about way more than just land. It is heritage and a sense of belonging. White South Africans, too, have raised concerns. They are worried about what this law might mean for them. Some fear they're going to be unfairly targeted and lose their land, even if they acquired it legally and they're using it productively. This fear isn't entirely unfounded either. There have been incidents of violence and intimidation directed at them. And some people point to these incidents as evidence of a broader agenda to sort of drive them off the land. That raises a really important point. How do we separate genuine concerns about fairness and due process from potentially unfounded fears, or even attempts to derail this whole process based on racial prejudice? That's the million-dollar question, and there are no easy answers. It's vital to acknowledge that violence and intimidation are never acceptable. But it's also important to avoid generalizations and recognize that these incidents, while concerning, don't necessarily mean there's this widespread systemic problem. Let's be cautious about drawing these broad conclusions based on a few isolated incidents. We need to use only reliable information from credible sources, as it's really easy to get swept up in the emotions of all this. Stay grounded in facts and move beyond the fear and the anxieties. How will they make sure that the land is actually used productively and that it benefits the people who need it most? Just transferring ownership doesn't automatically solve the problems of poverty or inequality. You need a much more comprehensive approach. You need access to capital, you need training programs, infrastructure development, markets. So it's not just as simple as giving people a plot, it is making sure they actually have the tools and the resources to make it work. Now let's talk about the international implications of this whole thing. The reactions from Trump and Musk. How is this being perceived by the wider global community? Could this actually have consequences for South Africa's standing on the world? Concerns have been raised among some observers, who worry it might be a sign that South Africa is moving away from its values and could damage its international reputation. The government needs to be aware of it as they move forward. But beyond just reputation, there are concrete, economic, or political consequences that could come out of this. One of the biggest concerns is the impact on foreign investment. That is why the government needs to make it absolutely clear that this isn't about arbitrary seizures of property. Let's switch gears for a second and talk about the role of the media in all of this. The way this is being reported in the media is a whole other issue. Some outlets frame it as an attack on white farmers, while others present it as a necessary step for justice. The reality is much more complex. As viewers, a healthy dose of skepticism is essential. We need to be critical consumers of information. Don't just believe sensational headlines. Dig deeper, look at multiple sources, and consider the motivations behind different narratives. Where does this leave us? South Africa is walking a tightrope between correcting past injustices and maintaining economic and legal stability. The world is watching closely to see how this plays out. What do you think? Should land reform be handled differently? Is the international criticism justified, or is it exaggerated? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and let's have a conversation.